Well, thank you very much for that very generous, warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here. It's a great honor to be invited to this very prestigious conference and to be invited to speak to this tremendously welcoming and very important group of scientists and clinicians, trainees, members of this community. So you already know who I am. If you want to stalk me on the interwebs, you can see some aspects of my Twitter, my Instagram, and my LinkedIn profile. Please feel free to connect with me and communicate. Networking across social media platforms can be very powerful for those people who don't always feel their voice is being heard. Wherever I give a talk in the world, and I've given talks in Australia, the US, Europe, over the last 12 to 18 months, I acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land where I currently do the work. And so I want to acknowledge, and I think it's very important that we all acknowledge, that there are indigenous people who may not be people who are represented in this community at this time, and yet they are people who looked after this land and have a very long and rich tradition, including in science and technology. So Ryerson is in the heart of Toronto, and Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations, peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have come into this treaty, and I changed the language of this formal land acknowledgement because these are living documents, these are living acknowledgements, and I don't believe the evidence does not support that people always were invited into these treaties. However, we come into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, and those are very important foundational guiding principles that are relevant to our discussion around equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is our Aboriginal elder, Joanne Dallaire, holding the wampum belt, which represents the actual treaty. This is our formal land acknowledgement. But land acknowledgements in Canada come out of much work that's been done in terms of truth and reconciliation to understand and acknowledge and try to move towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples within the land that we call Canada. And I use this land acknowledgement and this articulation of our land acknowledgement to remind people that these are calls to action. So what is your call to action? What is your response to this call to action in terms of how we can move towards reconciliation for those people who may not be in this room, may not be represented, may not have a voice in terms of determining how we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, particularly in science and medicine? My response is to try and amplify the voices of Indigenous scholars, particularly women Indigenous scholars, is to support Indigenous industries, to support Indigenous outreach in science and technology to members of the community around me, to members of those communities that I mentioned at the beginning. This is a little bit about me. I'm originally from the UK. I tell students that I went to school at Hogwarts because I have this accent. I grew up in Cambridge. I went to the University of Exeter. I did my graduate work on the west coast of Canada. I'm a dual Canadian-British citizen. I did a postdoc at UCSF, actually in sort of pathophysiology and cell biology of addiction, which is why I feel quite comfortable in some of the sessions this morning. I then moved back to Canada. I was in oncology and biochemistry at the University of Alberta, and I spent the last 20 years in Ontario at 2 different big universities there. I run a research lab and, as was mentioned, work on membrane transport proteins, particularly nucleoside transporters, which are involved in the uptake of drugs used in anti-cancer and antiviral therapies. I am an active scientist, and I put these two papers up here because the work that is often done, and often done by women in terms of social justice issues, particularly in science, or possibly science policy, or possibly science outreach, science communication, is often sort of demeaned, it's often undervalued, it's often treated as if it's something that happens when you aren't quite a real scientist, you aren't quite a successful scientist. You can't possibly be a real scientist and also talk about things like racism, privilege, those kinds of things. But actually you can. You can be a very good scientist, you can be a successful scientist, you can have a perfectly respectable scientific career, and you can also have an acquired expertise in things like equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. So I have acquired expertise. I have a long history of scholarship, of learning, of paying attention, of reading deeply, of being involved in various activities that has led me to be qualified to be an expert in these things alongside my career as a research scientist. It's possible to marry those two things together and for those things to be valued. Unfortunately, they're often not valued to the extent that they should be in science and medicine, but I think we're beginning to see more attention paid to the value and the merit that needs to be assigned to this kind of work. So, as was mentioned, there was a recent publication, a recent issue actually of The Lancet, which I highly recommend to everybody if you are interested in how do we shift the culture of science and medicine towards gender equity. And in that issue, which is free to download, it's not paywalled, there are many articles that speak to issues in the Global South. There are articles around shifting culture, strategies towards gender equality, pathways, and those kinds of things. And for those people who are interested in learning more about shifting gender equity in science and medicine, this is a great resource. And much of what I'm going to talk about is based on the article that I wrote along with my colleague Ryan Wiley in Toronto and Linda Gale Becker, who is a research scientist in South Africa. So a voice of the Global South, where they're doing some quite interesting things around shifting culture in science and medicine using legislated quotas, which is one way to go about doing things. But here, we tend to focus much more on this concept that we exist in science and medicine in a meritocracy. And obviously, a meritocracy is a myth. This is a quote from that paper. The myth of meritocracy is entrenched in academic science and medicine as it is in Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And those who continue to believe the combined myths of meritocracy and equity in science and medicine may then feel oppressed by initiatives aimed at achieving equality, which can result in pushback that can be retaliatory and hostile. So let's be quite open and blunt that sometimes when you're pushing for cultural change towards gender equity, some people aren't going to like that. They're going to feel threatened. And that's part of what we have to talk about and be quite open and blunt about. But we need leaders. We need engaged leaders, leadership, leaders who actively and visibly will challenge those long-held beliefs around gender and merit. And we need particularly male leaders. And I'm very encouraged to see how many men are in the audience here. Because those male leaders are often the ones with power and privilege and social capital. We also need white women who are leaders to use their social capital and their privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. And as a white woman with a British accent that puts me in a certain socioeconomic class, I have considerable privilege. I also have tenure, so I can say some things that maybe some other people can't say. So with privilege comes responsibility, and therefore it's up to those of us with privilege to act on that privilege and take responsibility for shifting cultures. Because other people who might be trying to shift cultures or increasing representation or pushing for more equity and more transparency, they will face the burden of a double dose of hostility, one for being present in science to begin with. You sure don't look like a scientist because you're the only woman of color in my chemistry graduate program, which is something that a colleague of mine told me she experienced. You don't belong here, and also you don't get to say what needs to be said. And we might think of Canada as being a sort of a bastion of small L liberal progressiveness, but I just want to disabuse you of that concept, because Canada has the same kind of challenges that everywhere else does in science and medicine. And this is just a little newsletter from a community that I gave a talk to a year ago, the medical physicists, newsletter somebody sent to me that had an article about the talk I had given. And in this newsletter was an opinion piece by Rowan Thompson, who has a prestigious Canada Research Chair, and she is an associate professor of physics at Carleton in Ottawa. And she talks about her experience, what can we do to support women in physics? And as you may recall, it was a woman in Canada who received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2018. She shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2018. She's the only third woman in physics, the only living woman in physics to get a Nobel Prize. And this was the anecdote that Rowan shared in this newsletter, which was that after Professor Strickland's Nobel Prize win announcement this week, a respected scientist remarked his surprise that another world-class, renowned male optics expert had been overlooked, quote, maybe because he was not a woman. So this goes on. People think it, people say it. This is what the culture is like for women, underrepresented groups in science still and in Canada. And I collect anecdotes. I've given hundreds of talks over the last few years. And I collect anecdotes because everywhere I go, somebody will come up to me after a talk and they will share their story with me. And so I collect them. I have binders and binders of anecdotes. And I just share a few here because it's across all professions with different degrees. This third one here I think is particularly entertaining. And again, this was from physics. A department chair or head answers a question from a candidate who had come for a job interview. The candidate had come to interview for a job and asked what kinds of equity, diversity, and inclusion activities were going on in the department. And the chair said, "That's an American thing. We never talk about diversity here. We get on with it and things work." Well, of course, that's not the case in Canada. We have the same challenges that many other places have, and we're grappling with how to deal with this. And how do you deal with this? Well, what I talk about and what I work towards are really evidence-informed, data-driven policy changes that address organizational, institutional, structural, and systemic barriers to full equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. There is nothing like dollars or money to incentivize, and we have to incentivize the behaviors we seek. We are not going to shift everybody's attitudes. We are not going to win over hearts and minds, but we can set behavioral expectations for how things need to be done, which is why we're going to talk about harassment. What do you do in a situation? What is appropriate behavior? What is unacceptable behavior? And one of the strongest ways to do that, either for individuals or for institutions, is to say you won't get funding if something, or we will take away your funding. So we have to incentivize, there has to be accountability. We need to have these programs based on data, both quantitative and qualitative, and sometimes it's hard to convince scientists and engineers and clinicians of the value of qualitative data. Very important. We need social scientists to come in and inform us with that, and we can look to leading practices in different places. Importantly, we need leadership, education, intentionality. This has to be at the front. It has to be in the frontal cortex here. It has to be executive function. It has to be intentional. We need accountability, and it takes courage, which is why people with privilege have the most responsibility. These are a few programs that some of you may be familiar with that look at organizational culture. So many of you will be familiar with ADVANCE, which is not really an organizational cultural shift program. It's more a research program, which looks at what is going on in your institution, where are the gaps, what can you do. The cons can be that it's a bit patchy, that it's post hoc, you've discovered something, but then how are you going to move to the next level, which is to implement change. The Athena Swan model is now a model that's been exported around the world. So the Athena Swan model program is a system, program, accreditation kind of program that has been around in the UK for almost 20 years now. And it was a program to increase participation of women in science, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine. They have an extra M in the UK. And it really wasn't seeing much progress until Sally Davis, who was the Minister of Health at that time, said, "I'm not seeing enough progress. I think I'll tie change, quantitative change in proportion numbers, to funding." At which point the universities sat up, took notice, and started to actually get engaged. The challenge with the Athena Swan program was that it was gender binary, that it was focused on science, and that it was overly bureaucratic. It's now moved on to further iterations, it's been updated, and it's proved to be quite effective when it is administered and run properly. That program was exported to Australia. It's known as the SAGE pilot in about 2017. It's an accreditation. You do a self-reflection, you do a self-assessment, you identify gaps and changes, maybe in your policies, your programs, your culture, you develop an action plan, and then you measure your progress towards that action plan. You set goals, and you're evaluated in a peer-reviewed manner for that. So it's peer review. You're evaluated by your peers. I've sat on a peer review panel in the UK, so I can talk about that if anybody's interested. In Australia, every institution signed on with about 6 months. So all of the universities, the research institutes, yes, we all want to be part of this. We all want to get our bronze medal. We all want to get our silver medal as we move forward, as we get better and better at shifting our cultures towards ones that are truly equitable. The challenge with the Australian system is that it was bureaucratic, there was a lack of capacity for peer review, and the Indigenous component the Aboriginal community that are part of the community in Australia were not really integrated as a core member of the community that was being focused on. Sea Change is the US version. I sit on the International Advisory Board for Sea Change, and it's administered by AAAS, again, an accreditation model. So adopting best practices based on data towards programs and policies that really create equitable, diverse, inclusive environments, not just for women, for everybody. Challenge in the US is you have so much data on so many things. How do you focus? Where is your focus? How are you actually going to manage peer review across multiple kinds of institutions and colleges? All of these programs have websites. You can follow up and read more. This is the UK. SAGE Pilot is run out of the Australian Academy of Science. Sea Change out of AAAS. And the Sea Change Awards, the first ones went out earlier this year, February 2019. And so they're looking at their second cohort now of pilot projects. In Canada, we have been leading up to adopting a program like this, but we have been developing policies through the federal funding agencies to really get universities to pay attention to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Who is not in the room? Who is missing? Who does not have a voice at the table? What do your policies look like? What do your research chair appointments look like? What do your hiring policies look like? What does your parental leave policy look like? All of these things that create culture that is either welcoming or exclusionary for women, for people of color, for people with disabilities, for members of the LGBTQ2S+ community, for people from underrepresented or marginalized communities. And so Canada has moved to a program called Dimensions, which actually I think has the potential of being best in world because it asks institutions to address obstacles, barriers, to access to opportunity, to engagement, the ability to contribute to the full potential across disciplines and across federally designated groups of underrepresented individuals. All of these programs share similar kinds of principles. Those are systems-level approaches, which is why everybody plays a role, particularly men, particularly straight, white, middle-class, middle-aged men, who hold much of the power and privilege and social capital and thus the ability to make change, whether it's this society or other science societies. That is not unusual. So it's implicit, we are all complicit, and it is all responsibility of all of us, also white women, who have a responsibility to use their social capital and their privilege to advocate and be activists for people from underrepresented groups. Every organizational culture is different. Every process, program, every self-assessment is context dependent. You have to start with self-reflection as an individual, and then self-reflection as a company, as an organization, as a division, as a department, as a faculty. You have to be honest and look at yourselves, all warts and all. Identify the gaps, identify the challenges, look at the data, collect the data, look at the data. It all starts with self-reflection, and it means looking at things like hiring practices, culture, and climate. It means requiring inclusive leadership. Nobody should be a dean, nobody should be a chair, nobody should be a president unless they have the core competencies or the core fluencies that demonstrate, and a demonstrated record of application of EDI principles in their previous activities. So EDI core competencies are key performance indicators. They are KPIs, and then you hold people accountable against those. We are working hard to ensure that EDI is integrated into research culture. That means, how do you build your research team? Do you rely on volunteer experience from undergraduates as part of your evaluation for a graduate student? Because being a volunteer represents a fair amount of privilege. Most of my students in downtown Toronto are working 2 or 3 jobs. Many of them are first-generation students. Many of them are the only member of their family that speaks fluent English, so if grandma has to go to the hospital, they go along too, so they can translate. So volunteering as a sort of a level of experience then can be problematic. It cannot be the only thing you look at. And then sex and gender-based analysis, or sex as a biological variable in research design, has to become core and mandatory. And it still shocks me when I sit on grant review panels how many grants I see where somebody will say, well, we're using cells in culture, so we don't have to worry about sex as a biological variable. Like, do you know the sex of your cells? Finally, EDI work is hard work. We're not seeking to change hearts and minds. If we do, that's great. But we seek to change culture, which means setting behavioral expectations, holding people accountable, and focusing on incentivizing and consequences. It's hard work. It should be expected of all of us. That is a core competency. We hire people with the expectation that they can demonstrate to us what their commitment and what their contribution to our EDI culture and my institution will be. It's part of their portfolio when they submit an application for a faculty position. It should be part of T&P, tenure and promotion, funding awards, leadership positions. And of course, people will push back against change. You need to expect this and be strategic and train people and plan for it. When you're accustomed to privilege, equity or equality feels like oppression. That can be toxic at times. I'm a woman with an opinion on the internet. You can imagine. Never read the comments if you write an article for a national newspaper. It's important to get comfortable with discomfort. And again, this is something that's a bit peculiarly Canadian. Canadians don't like people to be uncomfortable, very polite. Want people to be comfortable, get along. But actually, we need to sit in our discomfort. I hope people in this room are feeling uncomfortable right now, because then I've done my job. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, that means you're engaged. It means you're listening. It means you're thinking about things. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not paying attention. So get uncomfortable and be comfortable with that discomfort. And work from the business schools, from research in business schools, will tell us that discomfort is actually a very potent driver of innovation. Teams that are very diverse are more uncomfortable, but they work harder. They have to explain things over and over again. They challenge each other. They don't understand each other. And if you've had a lab with people from different countries who don't speak English as their first language or even their second language, you know that sometimes you have to work harder to be sure that everybody understands each other. So discomfort is a very powerful driver of innovation, and it's something we should embrace and learn to manage and learn to challenge. It all starts with reflection. Self-reflection as an individual, reflection as a small group, a lab group, reflection as a PI with multicultural groups of trainees, reflection as a chair, dean, reflection as a society president, reflection as an organization, honest reflection. And with that reflection, ultimately will come organizational cultural change. Thank you.